There is a house in England, with people sleeping behind its walls tonight, that was finished before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Walk past it on the street and you would guess the walls were stone, or thick plaster over brick. That is exactly what you are meant to assume. The truth is that those walls are mud and woven sticks, wet dirt, pressed by hand around a cage of green wood and left to harden in the open air. We have a word for that kind of building today. We call it primitive, a peasant stopgap, the kind of thing people supposedly settled for because they did not know any better. And yet the wall is still standing 600 years later, holding up a roof, keeping out the rain, while the concrete and brick we invented to replace it crack and crumble in a fraction of the time. This is the story of Wattle and Daub, the cheapest wall human beings ever built, and how it quietly outlasted nearly everything that came after it. How does a wall made of dirt and twigs outlast the stone and brick that replaced it? To answer that, you have to start with what Wattle and Daub actually is, because the name carries most of the explanation. The technique has two halves. The wattle is the skeleton. A builder takes thin, flexible lengths of wood, usually hazel, sometimes willow, oak, or elm, cut from a coppiced wood where the same stumps were harvested over and over for generations. He weaves them together into a lattice, the same basket weave used to make a sheep hurdle or a garden fence. This was not rough or careless work. The upright stakes, called staves, were set into a row of holes bored along the underside of one timber, then sprung down into a groove cut into the timber below, locking them into the frame. The lighter, more flexible rods, called withies, were then woven horizontally through the staves until the whole gap was filled with a tight wooden mesh. In different parts of the country, builders wove different patterns, some in simple squares, some in a diagonal herringbone that spread sideways stress across the panel and helped it resist cracking. None of it required a nail. The daub is the flesh. It is the mud that gets packed into and over that mesh, pressed in from both sides at the same time until it squeezes through the gaps, grips the wood, and sets into a single solid panel. A woman named Sarah Partridge, who teaches the craft at Orchard Barn in East Anglia, describes the whole thing in 3 words: mud and sticks. That is it. That is the wall that housed most of Europe for 1,000 years. One detail matters before we go further, because it explains why these walls survive at all. In a timber-framed house, the wattle and daub is not holding the building up. The oak frame does that. The great posts and beams carry the entire weight of the roof and the floors above. The mud panels just fill the empty squares between the timbers, keeping the weather out and the warmth in. A typical panel is only 4 or 5 inches thick. That division of labour is the first secret. When a panel cracks, the house does not care because the frame is still standing. You scrape out the old daub and pack in new. Try doing that with a load-bearing brick wall. That brings us to the detail almost everyone misses. What was actually in the mud? Daub was not just dirt scraped off the ground. It was a recipe, and a careful one, built from 3 kinds of ingredient doing 3 different jobs. First, a binder, almost always clay, the sticky element that glues everything together as it dries. Second, an aggregate, usually sand or a gritty subsoil, which gives the mix bulk and stops it from shrinking and cracking as the water leaves. Third, a reinforcement, and this is the clever part. Straw, hay, animal hair, whatever fibrous material was on hand. A common mix ran about 1 part clay to 3 parts filler, adjusted by feel for whatever the local ground happened to give you. That reinforcement is what turns mud into a building material. On its own, dried clay is brittle and it snaps. But thread thousands of strands of straw and hair all through it, and the fibres hold the whole mass together under tension, the way steel rebar holds tension inside a slab of concrete. The clay takes the squeezing force, the straw takes the pulling force, and the panel stops being a clod of dirt and starts behaving like a composite material. People were building reinforced walls thousands of years before anyone wrote down the physics of why reinforcement works. And then there is the ingredient nobody likes to talk about. Dung. Cow dung in particular turns up again and again in Old Daub. There is a long-running argument among conservators about whether medieval builders added it deliberately or whether it simply came along for the ride. The most likely answer is wonderfully practical. The straw they used was old bedding straw hauled out of the animal sheds, already churned together with manure because fresh straw was too valuable to waste on a wall. And the mixing itself was often done by penning livestock onto a heap of wet subsoil overnight and letting them trample it into a smooth paste, adding their own contribution as they walked. The recipe, in other words, was whatever the farmyard produced, including what the animals left behind. It worked anyway. Once mixed, the daub was forced into the wattle, worked until it formed gripping ridges behind the lattice that locked it in place, and then left to cure. Depending on the weather, that could take a week, or it could take well over a month. When it had hardened, the surface was scratched to give the next layer something to bite into, coated in a lime plaster, and finished with a wash of lime wash that shed rain while still letting the wall breathe. In wealthier homes, that final coat was decorated with patterns combed and pressed into the wet plaster, a craft called pargeting. The black-beamed, white-panelled look we now call Tudor in England and Fachwerk in Germany was exactly this, scaled up across entire towns. The frame itself became a way of showing off. The wealthiest owners packed their walls with closely spaced uprights, a style called close studding, precisely because it burned through expensive oak and announced that you could afford to waste it. Poorer households made do with wide, square panels and far less timber. The mud filling behind it was the same in both cases. The only real difference was how much wood you could afford to wrap around it. There is one more thing the daub preserved, and it is strangely moving. Because the mud was soft when it went on, it caught and kept whatever pressed into it. Archaeologists working on these panels regularly find the fingerprints of the people who packed them, along with the imprints of the straw and the marks of the tools they used. The wall remembers the hands that built it. But this was never only an English habit, and it was never a medieval invention. There is a reason the same idea keeps surfacing in every corner of the map. Wattle and daub is one of the oldest building methods on Earth, and the evidence runs back at least 6,000 years. Archaeologists found it in Egyptian sites like Merimda and El Omari, dating to the 5th millennium before Christ, where mud and reed walls were standard long before anyone fired a mud brick. They found it at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, one of the first towns human beings ever built. In China, wattle and daub houses rose along the Yangtze River between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago and stayed the dominant form of home for roughly 4,000 years after that. The Mississippian peoples of North America built with it. The Ashanti of West Africa built with it. The Sumerians used it, the Romans used it, and communities across South America and the Pacific arrived at it independently because the raw materials sit under everyone's feet. In Iron Age Britain, long before the Romans landed, whole roundhouses were built this way, their stakes driven straight into the earth and woven over. The Romans, characteristically, left a written complaint about it. The architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century before Christ, said he wished wattle and daub had never been invented, because it cracked along the joints and caught fire too easily. And then grudgingly, in the very next breath, he wrote down the correct way to build it anyway. Set it on a high foundation, he warned, so the mud never touches the wet ground and rots. 2,000 years later, that is still the single most important rule for keeping one of these walls alive. A Roman who openly hated the stuff documented the engineering so carefully that his instructions still hold up today. Step back and the whole picture flips. Wattle and Daub was not a primitive phase that humanity stumbled through on the way to real buildings. It was the default housing of our species for most of recorded history on nearly every continent, sometimes for thousands of years without interruption. There is a reason it is still standing in so many places, which raises the obvious question: if it was that good, why is almost nobody building this way now? And why have so many of us never even heard the name? Before we get to how it died, we need the harder question. Why did the good ones last so long? You already have the first reason. The load-bearing frame means a damaged panel is a quick repair, not a structural emergency. The second reason is flexibility. A Wattle and Daub panel is not rigid the way a brick wall is rigid. As the timber frame shifts and settles over the centuries, as the ground moves and the wood swells and shrinks through the seasons, the mud panel flexes along with it instead of fighting it. Rigid masonry under that same slow stress cracks and fails. The soft wall just rides the movement year after year, decade after decade. The third reason is the one we understand the least, and it is the heart of the whole thing. A Wattle and Daub wall breathes. Clay and lime are both porous and hygroscopic, which means the wall constantly pulls moisture out of damp air and then releases it again when the air dries out. Water never gets trapped inside. It moves through the wall and back out. As long as that breathing surface stays intact, the oak frame buried in the wall stays dry, and dry oak does not rot. That is the actual mechanism behind a 600-year-old wall. Not magic, not some lost super technology. A material that manages water instead of trapping it, looked after by people who understood it, and patched it the moment it needed patching. If digging up this kind of buried practical knowledge is why you are here, that is the whole reason Medieval Way exists. Over at medievalway.store, we have run the same investigation through the medieval kitchen. The sourdough manual rebuilds bread the way it was made before commercial yeast, and the Practical Refined Recipes cookbook brings forgotten everyday cooking back to a modern table. The link is in the description. Now, back to the walls. Maintenance was part of the design, not a failure of it. A fresh coat of lime wash brushed over the wall every few years was a cheap afternoon's work that reset its protection, and a cracked panel was a job any farmhand could handle with a barrow of mud. The house was never meant to be finished and forgotten. It was meant to be lived with, which is exactly where the modern part of this story turns dark. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains how we nearly lost these houses entirely. In the 20th century, with most of the old knowledge already gone, well-meaning people started doing two things to these ancient buildings that quietly began to kill them. First, they fell in love with the look of bare black timber, so they stripped off the protective plaster that had always covered the frame and the panels together, leaving the wood and the soft daub exposed to the rain. Second, when panels needed repair, they patched them with modern cement render and sealed them under modern waterproof paint, because that is what the hardware store sells. Both moves do the same fatal thing. They stop the wall from breathing. The cement traps water against the oak. The exposed timber drinks up rain it was never built to face alone. And the frame that stood untouched for 6 centuries begins to rot from the inside within a single generation. People believed they were improving these houses. They were strangling them. We did not only forget how to build these walls, we forgot how to leave them alone. The forgetting did not start in the 20th century, though. It began 300 years earlier when the wall first fell out of fashion. By the 1600s, the ground was already shifting under Wattle and Daub, and the thing that finished it off was not a weakness in the wall. It was money, and it was fashion. Brick, once a luxury reserved for the wealthy, started getting cheaper as kilns multiplied and production industrialized. After disasters like the Great Fire of London in 1666, cities pushed hard toward masonry that would not burn, and new rebuilding laws favoured brick and stone over timber and mud. Almost overnight, in cultural terms, brick came to mean progress and money, while mud came to mean poverty and the past. The same kind of wall that had sheltered merchants and minor lords for centuries was suddenly the mark of a backward country cottage. Inside the house, Wattle and Daub's own direct descendant quietly replaced it. Lath and plaster is the same basic idea, with the rough woven sticks swapped out for neat sawn wooden strips, and it took over interior walls because it used standardized, factory-friendly materials. Centuries later, lath and plaster would itself be replaced by the plasterboard hanging in your walls right now. The original craft did not vanish in a day. It faded generation by generation as fewer people learned it and more people sneered at it. If brick had stayed expensive, half of England might still be built of mud today. Instead, the knowledge slipped out of living memory so completely that by the late 20th century, most people living inside a timber-framed house could not have told you what was actually holding their walls together. And through every bit of that, the old walls never left. They are still here. Across England, conservators regularly open up timber-framed buildings and find original Wattle and Daub panels that are 600 years old and still doing their job. Specialists who repair these structures say that in sheltered, well-maintained conditions, a daub panel should last essentially indefinitely, and they point to surviving examples around 700 years old as proof. Whole towns of these buildings still stand, like Lavenham in Suffolk, where Tudor houses lean at impossible angles and have done so for half a millennium. Cruck-framed barns from the 13th and 14th centuries still carry their original infill. The technique even crossed the ocean. The first English colonists at Jamestown built with Wattle and Daub, and the Fairbanks House in Dedham, Massachusetts, raised in the 17th century and still standing, preserves the same English tradition in American wood. Far from being a dead craft, Wattle and Daub is quietly coming back. Natural builders use it because it is close to carbon neutral, made from coppiced wood that stores carbon as it grows, and from subsoil dug a few feet from the site. Heritage organisations like the Weald and Downland Living Museum run courses teaching people to weave the wattle and mix the daub by hand again. And the engineers studying it keep landing on the same uncomfortable verdict. A properly built, properly maintained mud wall, kept dry and allowed to breathe, may well outlast the reinforced concrete we are pouring today, concrete we already know will crack, corrode, and need tearing down inside a single human lifetime. Which leaves us with the real lesson buried in all of this. We took every building material human beings have ever used, sorted it into two piles marked primitive and advanced, and on this one we got the labels backward. The mud wall was not a clumsy stage our ancestors were lucky to grow out of. It was a solution so cheap, so repairable, and so durable that it served the entire species for 6,000 years across nearly every continent on the planet. We walked away from it for materials that need replacing every few decades and leave poison in the ground when they go. The house in England with people sleeping behind its mud walls tonight is not a monument to how little they knew. It is evidence of how much we have forgotten. If you found this worth your time, hit the like button and subscribe. We dig up the forgotten knowledge the modern world threw away, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them solved problems we no longer even remember having. Tell us in the comments which forgotten building technique we should investigate next, and we will keep digging.